Section 9 of Science and the Modern World by Alfred Whitehead. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9. Science and Philosophy. In the present lecture it is my object to consider some reactions of science upon the stream of philosophic thought during the modern centuries with which we are concerned. I shall make no attempt to compress a history of modern philosophy within the limits of one lecture. We shall merely consider some contacts between science and philosophy, in so far as they lie within the scheme of thought which it is the purpose of these lectures to develop. For this reason the whole of the great German idealistic movement will be ignored, as being out of effective touch with its contemporary science so far as reciprocal modification of concepts is concerned. Kant, from whom this movement took its rise, was saturated with Newtonian physics, and with the ideas of the great French physicists, such as Clairaut, for instance, who developed the Newtonian ideas. But the philosophers who developed the Kantian school of thought, or who transformed it into Hegelianism, either lacked Kant's background of scientific knowledge, or lacked his potentiality of becoming a great physicist if philosophy had not absorbed his main energies. The origin of modern philosophy is analogous to that of science, and is contemporaneous. The general trend of its development was settled in the 17th century, partly at the hands of the same men who established the scientific principles. This settlement of purpose followed upon a transitional period dating from the 15th century. There was, in fact, a general movement of European mentality, which carried along with its stream religion, science, and philosophy. It may shortly be characterized as being the direct recurrence to the original sources of Greek inspiration on the part of men whose spiritual shape had been derived from inheritance from the Middle Ages. There was, therefore, no revival of Greek mentality. Epochs do not rise from the dead. The principles of aesthetics and of reason, which animated the Greek civilization, were reclothed in a modern mentality. Between the two there lay other religions, other systems of law, other anarchies, and other racial inheritances, dividing the living from the dead. Philosophy is peculiarly sensitive to such differences, for whereas you can make a replica of an ancient statue, there is no possible replica of an ancient state of mind. There can be no nearer approximation than that which a masquerade bears to real life. There may be understanding of the past, but there is a difference between the modern and the ancient reactions to the same stimuli. In the particular case of philosophy, the distinction in tonality lies on the surface. Modern philosophy is tinged with subjectivism, as against the objective attitude of the ancients. The same change is to be seen in religion. In the early history of the Christian Church, the theological interest centred in discussions on the nature of God, the meaning of the Incarnation, and apocalyptic forecasts of the ultimate fate of the world. At the Reformation, the Church was torn asunder by dissension as to the individual experiences of believers in respect to justification. The individual subject of experience had been substituted for the total drama of all reality. Luther asked, "How am I justified?" Modern philosophers have asked, "How do I have knowledge?" The emphasis lies upon the subject of experience. This change of standpoint is the work of Christianity in its pastoral aspect of shepherding the company of believers. For century after century it insisted upon the infinite worth of the individual human soul. Accordingly, to the instinctive egotism of physical desires, it has superadded an instinctive feeling of justification for an egotism of intellectual outlook. Every human being is the natural guardian of his own importance. Without a doubt, this modern direction of attention emphasizes truths of the highest value. For example, in the field of practical life, it has abolished slavery and has impressed upon the popular imagination the primary rights of mankind. Descartes, in his Discourse on Method and in his Meditations, discloses with great clearness the general conceptions which have since influenced modern philosophy. There is a subject receiving experience. In the discourse this subject is always mentioned in the first person, that is to say, as being Descartes himself. Descartes starts with himself as being a mentality, which, in virtue of its consciousness of its own inherent presentations of sense and of thought, is thereby conscious of its own existence as a unit entity. The subsequent history of philosophy revolves round the Cartesian formulation of the primary datum. The ancient world takes its stand upon the drama of the universe, the modern world upon the inward drama of the soul. Descartes, in his Meditations, expressly grounds the existence of this inward drama upon the possibility of error. There may be no correspondence with objective fact, and thus there must be a soul with activities whose reality is purely derivative from itself. For example, here is a quotation from Meditation 2. "But it will be said that these presentations are false, and that I am dreaming. Let it be so. At all events it is certain that I seem to see light, hear a noise, and feel heat. This cannot be false, and this is what in me is properly called perceiving, sentire, which is nothing else than thinking. From this I begin to know what I am with somewhat greater clearness and distinctness than heretofore. Again in Meditation 3. For as I before remarked, although the things which I perceive or imagine are perhaps nothing at all apart from me, I am nevertheless assured that those modes of consciousness which I call perceptions and imaginations, in as far only as they are modes of consciousness, exist in me. The objectivism of the medieval and the ancient worlds passed over into science. Nature is there conceived as for itself, with its own mutual reactions. Under the recent influence of relativity, there has been a tendency towards subjectivist formulations. But apart from this recent exception, nature, in scientific thought, has had its laws formulated without any reference to dependence on individual observers. There is, however, this difference between the older and the later attitudes towards science. The anti-rationalism of the moderns has checked any attempt to harmonize the ultimate concepts of science with ideas drawn from a more concrete survey of the whole of reality. The material, the space, the time, the various laws concerning the transition of material configurations are taken as ultimate stubborn facts, not to be tampered with. The effect of this antagonism to philosophy has been equally unfortunate both for philosophy and for science. In this lecture we are concerned with philosophy. Philosophers are rationalists. They are seeking to go behind stubborn and irreducible facts. They wish to explain in the light of universal principles the mutual reference between the various details entering into the flux of things. Also, they seek such principles as will eliminate mere arbitrariness, so that, whatever portion of fact is assumed or given, the existence of the remainder of things shall satisfy some demand of rationality. They demand meaning. In the words of Henry Sidgwick, "It is the primary aim of philosophy to unify completely, bring into clear coherence, all departments of rational thought, and this aim cannot be realized by any philosophy that leaves out of its view the important body of judgments and reasonings which form the subject matter of ethics." Accordingly, the bias towards history on the part of the physical and social sciences, with their refusal to rationalize below some ultimate mechanism, has pushed philosophy out of the affective currents of modern life. It has lost its proper role as a constant critic of partial formulations. It has retreated into the subjectivist sphere of mind, by reason of its expulsion by science from the objectivist sphere of matter. Thus the evolution of thought in the 17th century cooperated with the enhanced sense of individual personality derived from the Middle Ages. We see Descartes taking his stand upon his own ultimate mind, which his philosophy assures him of, and asking about its relations to the ultimate matter, exemplified in the second meditation by the human body and a lump of wax, which his science assumes. There is Aaron's rod and the magician's serpents, and the only question for philosophy is which swallows which, or whether, as Descartes thought, they all lived happily together. In this stream of thought are to be found Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Kant. Two great names lie outside this list, Spinoza and Leibniz. But there is a certain isolation of both of them in respect to their philosophical influence so far as science is concerned. As though they had strayed to extremes which lie outside the boundaries of safe philosophy, Spinoza by retaining older ways of thought, and Leibniz by the novelty of his monads. The history of philosophy runs curiously parallel to that of science. In the case of both, the 17th century set the stage for its two successors. But with the 20th century a new act commences. It is an exaggeration to attribute a general change in a climate of thought to any one piece of writing, or to any one author. No doubt Descartes only expressed definitely and in decisive form what was already in the air of his period. Analogously, in attributing to William James the inauguration of a new stage in philosophy, we should be neglecting other influences of his time. But admitting this, there still remains a certain fitness in contrasting his essay, Does Consciousness Exist?, published in 1904, with Descartes' Discourse on Method, published in 1637. James clears the stage of the old paraphernalia, or rather he entirely alters its lighting. Take, for example, these two sentences from his essay. To deny plumply that consciousness exists seems so absurd on the face of it, for undeniably thoughts do exist, that I fear some readers will follow me no farther. Let me then immediately explain that I mean only to deny that the word stands for an entity, but to insist most emphatically that it does stand for a function. The scientific materialism and the Cartesian ego were both challenged at the same moment, one by science and the other by philosophy, as represented by William James with his psychological antecedents. And the double challenge marks the end of a period which lasted for about 250 years. Of course, matter and consciousness both express something so evident in ordinary experience that any philosophy must provide some things which answer to their respective meanings. But the point is that, in respect to both of them, the 17th century settlement was infected with a presupposition which is now challenged. James denies that consciousness is an entity, but admits that it is a function. The discrimination between an entity and a function is therefore vital to the understanding of the challenge which James is advancing against the older modes of thought. In the essay in question, the character which James assigns to consciousness is fully discussed, but he does not unambiguously explain what he means by the notion of an entity, which he refuses to apply to consciousness. In the sentence which immediately follows the one which I have already quoted, he says, "There is, I mean, no aboriginal stuff or quality of being, contrasted with that of which material objects are made, out of which our thoughts of them are made. But there is a function in experience which thoughts perform, and for the performance of which this quality of being is invoked. That function is knowing. Consciousness is supposed necessary to explain the fact that things not only are, but get reported, are known." Thus James is denying that consciousness is a stuff. The term entity, or even that of stuff, does not fully tell its own tale. The notion of entity is so general that it may be taken to mean anything that can be thought about. You cannot think of mere nothing, and the something which is an object of thought may be called an entity. In this sense, a function is an entity. Obviously, this is not what James had in his mind. In agreement with the organic theory of nature which I have been tentatively putting forward in these lectures, I shall for my own purposes construe James as denying exactly what Descartes asserts in his discourse and his meditations. Descartes discriminates two species of entities, matter and soul. The essence of matter is spatial extension. The essence of soul is its cogitation, in the full sense which Descartes assigns to the word cogitare. For example, in section 53 of part 1 of his Principles of Philosophy, he enunciates that of every substance there is one principal attribute, as thinking of the mind, extension of the body. In the earlier 51st section, Descartes states, "By substance we can conceive nothing else than a thing which exists in such a way as to stand in need of nothing beyond itself in order to its existence." Furthermore, later on, Descartes says, "For example, because any substance which ceases to endure ceases also to exist, duration is not distinct from substance except in thought." Thus we conclude that, for Descartes, minds and bodies exist in such a way as to stand in need of nothing beyond themselves individually. God only excepted, as being the foundation of all things. That both minds and bodies endure, because without endurance they would cease to exist. That spatial extension is the essential attribute of bodies, and that cogitation is the essential attribute of minds. It is difficult to praise too highly the genius exhibited by Descartes in the complete sections of his Principles which deal with these questions. It is worthy of the century in which he writes and of the clearness of the French intellect. Descartes, in his distinction between time and duration, and in his way of grounding time upon motion, and in his close relation between matter and extension, anticipates, as far as it was possible at his epoch, modern notions suggested by the doctrine of relativity, or by some aspects of Bergson's doctrine of the generation of things. But the fundamental principles are so set out as to presuppose independently existing substances with simple location in a community of temporal durations, and, in the case of bodies, with simple location in the community of spatial extensions. Those principles lead straight to the theory of a materialistic, mechanistic nature, surveyed by cogitating minds. After the close of the 17th century, science took charge of the materialistic nature, and philosophy took charge of the cogitating minds. Some schools of philosophy admitted an ultimate dualism, and the various idealistic schools claimed that nature was merely the chief example of the cogitations of minds. But all schools admitted the Cartesian analysis of the ultimate elements of nature. I am excluding Spinoza and Leibniz from these statements as to the mainstream of modern philosophy, as derivative from Descartes, though of course they were influenced by him, and in their turn influenced philosophers. I am thinking mainly of the effective contacts between science and philosophy. This division of territory between science and philosophy was not a simple business, and in fact it illustrated the weakness of the whole cut-and-dried presupposition upon which it rested. We are aware of nature as an interplay of bodies, colours, sounds, scents, tastes, touches, and other various bodily feelings, displayed as in space, in patterns of mutual separation by intervening volumes, and of individual shape. Also the whole is a flux, changing with the lapse of time. This systematic totality is disclosed to us as one complex of things. But the 17th century dualism cuts straight across it. The objective world of science was confined to mere spatial material with simple location in space and time, and subjected to definite rules as to its locomotion. The subjective world of philosophy annexed the colours, sounds, scents, tastes, touches, bodily feelings, as forming the subjective content of the cogitations of the individual minds. Both worlds shared in the general flux, but time as measured is assigned by Descartes to the cogitations of the observer's mind. There is obviously one fatal weakness to this scheme. The cogitations of mind exhibit themselves as holding up entities, such as colours, for instance, before the mind as the termini of contemplation. But in this theory these colours are, after all, merely the furniture of the mind. Accordingly, the mind seems to be confined to its own private world of cogitations. The subject-object conformation of experience in its entirety lies within the mind as one of its private passions. This conclusion from the Cartesian data is the starting point from which Berkeley, Hume, and Kant developed their respective systems. And antecedently to them, it was the point upon which Locke concentrated as being the vital question. Thus the question as to how any knowledge is obtained of the truly objective world of science becomes a problem of the first magnitude. Descartes states that the objective body is perceived by the intellect. He says, Meditation 2, "I must, therefore, admit that I cannot even comprehend by imagination what the piece of wax is, and that it is the mind alone which perceives it. I speak of one piece in particular, for as to wax in general, this is still more evident. But what is the piece of wax that can be perceived only by the mind? The perception of it is neither an act of sight, of touch, nor of imagination, and never was either of these, though it might formerly seem so, but is simply an intuition, inspectio, of the mind." It must be noted that the Latin word inspectio is associated in its classical use with the notion of theory as opposed to practice. The two great preoccupations of modern philosophy now lie clearly before us. The study of mind divides into psychology, or the study of mental functionings as considered in themselves and in their mutual relations, and into epistemology, or the theory of the knowledge of a common objective world. In other words, there is the study of the cogitations, qua passions of the mind, and their study qua leading to an inspection, intuition, of an objective world. This is a very uneasy division, giving rise to a host of perplexities whose consideration has occupied the intervening centuries. As long as men thought in terms of physical notions for the objective world and of mentality for the subjective world, the setting out of the problem as achieved by Descartes sufficed as a starting point. But the balance has been upset by the rise of physiology. In the 17th century, men passed from the study of physics to the study of philosophy. Towards the end of the 19th century, notably in Germany, men passed from the study of physiology to the study of psychology. The change in tone has been decisive. Of course, in the earlier period, the intervention of the human body was fully considered, for example, by Descartes in Part 5 of the Discourse on Method. But the physiological instinct had not been developed. In considering the human body, Descartes thought with the outfit of a physicist, whereas the modern psychologists are clothed with the mentalities of medical physiologists. The career of William James is an example of this change in standpoint. He also possessed the clear, incisive genius which could state in a flash the exact point at issue. The reason why I have put Descartes and James in close juxtaposition is now evident. Neither philosopher finished an epoch by a final solution of a problem. Their great merit is of the opposite sort. They each of them opened an epoch by their clear formulation of terms in which thought could profitably express itself at particular stages of knowledge, one for the 17th century, the other for the 20th century. In this respect they are both to be contrasted with St. Thomas Aquinas, who expressed the culmination of Aristotelian scholasticism. In many ways neither Descartes nor James were the most characteristic philosophers of their respective epochs. I should be disposed to ascribe these positions to Locke and to Bergson respectively, at least so far as concerns their relations to the science of their times. Locke developed the lines of thought which kept philosophy on the move. For example, he emphasized the appeal to psychology. He initiated the age of epoch-making inquiries into urgent problems of limited scope. Undoubtedly, in so doing, he infected philosophy with something of the anti-rationalism of science. But the very groundwork of a fruitful methodology is to start from those clear postulates which must be held to be ultimate so far as concerns the occasion in question. The criticism of such methodological postulates is thus reserved for another opportunity. Locke discovered that the philosophical situation bequeathed by Descartes involved the problems of epistemology and psychology. Bergson introduced into philosophy the organic conceptions of physiological science. He has most completely moved away from the static materialism of the 17th century. His protest against spatialization is a protest against taking the Newtonian conception of nature as being anything except a high abstraction. His so-called anti-intellectualism should be construed in this sense. In some respects he recurs to Descartes, but the recurrence is accompanied with an instinctive grasp of modern biology. There is another reason for associating Locke and Bergson. The germ of an organic theory of nature is to be found in Locke. His most recent expositor, Professor Gibson, states that Locke's way of conceiving the identity of self-consciousness, like that of a living organism, involves a genuine transcending of the mechanical view of nature and of mind, embodied in the composition theory. But it is to be noticed that in the first place Locke wavers in his grasp of this position, and in the second place, what is more important still, he only applies his idea to self-consciousness. The physiological attitude has not yet established itself. The effect of physiology was to put mind back into nature. The neurologist traces first the effect of stimuli along the bodily nerves, then integration at nerve centres, and finally the rise of a projective reference beyond the body with a resulting motor efficacy in renewed nervous excitement. In biochemistry, the delicate adjustment of the chemical composition of the parts to the preservation of the whole organism is detected. Thus, the mental cognition is seen as the reflective experience of a totality, reporting for itself what it is in itself as one unit occurrence. This unit is the integration of the sum of its partial happenings, but it is not their numerical aggregate. It has its own unity as an event. This total unity, considered as an entity for its own sake, is the prehension into unity of the patterned aspects of the universe of events. Its knowledge of itself arises from its own relevance to the things of which it prehends the aspects. It knows the world as a system of mutual relevance, and thus sees itself as mirrored in other things. These other things include more especially the various parts of its own body. It is important to discriminate the bodily pattern, which endures, from the bodily event, which is pervaded by the enduring pattern, and from the parts of the bodily event. The parts of the bodily event are themselves pervaded by their own enduring patterns, which form elements in the bodily pattern. The parts of the body are really portions of the environment of the total bodily event, but so related that their mutual aspects, each in the other, are peculiarly effective in modifying the pattern of either. This arises from the intimate character of the relation of whole to part. Thus the body is a portion of the environment for the part, and the part is a portion of the environment for the body, only they are peculiarly sensitive, each to modifications of the other. This sensitiveness is so arranged that the part adjusts itself to preserve the stability of the pattern of the body. It is a peculiar example of the favourable environment shielding the organism. The relation of part to whole has the special reciprocity associated with the notion of organism, in which the part is for the whole. But this relation reigns throughout nature and does not start with the special case of the higher organisms. Further, viewing the question as a matter of chemistry, there is no need to construe the actions of each molecule in a living body by its exclusive particular reference to the pattern of the complete living organism. It is true that each molecule is affected by the aspect of this pattern as mirrored in it, so as to be otherwise than what it would have been if placed elsewhere. In the same way, under some circumstances an electron may be a sphere, and under other circumstances an egg-shaped volume. The mode of approach to the problem, so far as science is concerned, is merely to ask if molecules exhibit in living bodies properties which are not to be observed amid inorganic surroundings. In the same way, in a magnetic field, soft iron exhibits magnetic properties which are in abeyance elsewhere. The prompt self-preservative actions of living bodies, and our experience of the physical actions of our bodies following the determinations of will, suggest the modification of molecules in the body as the result of the total pattern. It seems possible that there may be physical laws expressing the modification of the ultimate basic organisms when they form part of higher organisms with adequate compactness of pattern. It would, however, be entirely in consonance with the empirically observed action of environments if the direct effects of aspects as between the whole body and its parts were negligible. We should expect transmission. In this way the modification of total pattern would transmit itself by means of a series of modifications of a descending series of parts, so that finally the modification of the cell changes its aspect in the molecule, thus effecting a corresponding alteration in the molecule, or in some subtler entity. Thus the question for physiology is the question of the physics of molecules in cells of different characters. We can now see the relation of psychology to physiology and to physics. The private psychological field is merely the event considered from its own standpoint. The unity of this field is the unity of the event. But it is the event as one entity, and not the event as a sum of parts. The relations of the parts, to each other and to the whole, are their aspects, each in the other. A body, for an external observer, is the aggregate of the aspects for him of the body as a whole, and also of the body as a sum of parts. For the external observer the aspects of shape and of sense objects are dominant, at least for cognition. But we must also allow for the possibility that we can detect in ourselves direct aspects of the mentalities of higher organisms. The claim that the cognition of alien mentalities must necessarily be by means of indirect inferences from aspects of shape and of sense objects is wholly unwarranted by this philosophy of organism. The fundamental principle is that whatever merges into actuality implants its aspects in every individual event. Further, even for self-cognition, the aspects of the parts of our own bodies partly take the form of aspects of shape and of sense objects. But that part of the bodily event, in respect to which the cognitive mentality is associated, is for itself the unit psychological field. Its ingredients are not referent to the event itself. They are aspects of what lies beyond that event. Thus the self-knowledge inherent in the bodily event is the knowledge of itself as a complex unity, whose ingredients involve all reality beyond itself, restricted under the limitation of its pattern of aspects. Thus we know ourselves as a function of unification of a plurality of things which are other than ourselves. Cognition discloses an event as being an activity, organizing a real togetherness of alien things. But this psychological field does not depend on its cognition, so that this field is still a unit event as abstracted from its self-cognition. Accordingly, consciousness will be the function of knowing. But what is known is already a prehension of aspects of the one real universe. These aspects are aspects of other events as mutually modifying, each the others. In the pattern of aspects they stand in their pattern of mutual relatedness. The aboriginal data in terms of which the pattern weaves itself are the aspects of shapes, of sense objects, and of other eternal objects whose self-identity is not dependent on the flux of things. Wherever such objects have ingression into the general flux, they interpret events, each to the other. They are here in the perceiver, but as perceived by him, they convey for him something of the total flux which is beyond himself. The subject-object relation takes its origin in the double role of these eternal objects. They are modifications of the subject, but only in their character of conveying aspects of other subjects in the community of the universe. Thus no individual subject can have independent reality, since it is a prehension of limited aspects of subjects other than itself. The technical phrase subject-object is a bad term for the fundamental situation disclosed in experience. It is really reminiscent of the Aristotelian subject-predicate. It already presupposes the metaphysical doctrine of diverse subjects qualified by their private predicates. This is the doctrine of subjects with private worlds of experience. If this be granted, there is no escape from solipsism. The point is that the phrase subject-object indicates a fundamental entity underlying the objects. Thus the objects, as thus conceived, are merely the ghosts of Aristotelian predicates. The primary situation disclosed in cognitive experience is ego-object amid objects. By this I mean that the primary fact is an impartial world transcending the here-now, which marks the ego-object, and transcending the now, which is the spatial world of simultaneous realization. It is a world also including the actuality of the past and the limited potentiality of the future, together with the complete world of abstract potentiality, the realm of eternal objects, which transcends and finds exemplification in and comparison with the actual course of realization. The ego-object, as consciousness here now, is conscious of its experient essence as constituted by its internal relatedness to the world of realities and to the world of ideas. But the ego-object, in being thus constituted, is within the world of realities, and exhibits itself as an organism requiring the ingression of ideas for the purpose of this status among realities. This question of consciousness must be reserved for treatment on another occasion. The point to be made for the purposes of the present discussion is that a philosophy of nature as organic must start at the opposite end to that requisite for a materialistic philosophy. The materialistic starting point is from independently existing substances, matter and mind. The matter suffers modifications of its external relations of locomotion, and the mind suffers modifications of its contemplated objects. There are in this materialistic theory two sorts of independent substances, each qualified by their appropriate passions. The organic starting point is from the analysis of process as the realization of events disposed in an interlocked community. The event is the unit of things real. The emergent enduring pattern is the stabilization of the emergent achievement so as to become a fact which retains its identity throughout the process. It will be noted that endurance is not primarily the property of enduring beyond itself, but of enduring within itself. I mean that endurance is the property of finding its pattern reproduced in the temporal parts of the total event. It is in this sense that a total event carries an enduring pattern. There is an intrinsic value identical for the whole and for its succession of parts. Cognition is the emergence, into some measure of individualized reality, of the general substratum of activity, poising before itself possibility, actuality, and purpose. It is equally possible to arrive at this organic conception of the world if we start from the fundamental notions of modern physics, instead of, as above, from psychology and physiology. In fact, by reason of my own studies in mathematics and mathematical physics, I did in fact arrive at my convictions in this way. Mathematical physics presumes in the first place an electromagnetic field of activity pervading space and time. The laws which condition this field are nothing else than the conditions observed by the general activity of the flux of the world, as it individualizes itself in the events. In physics there is an abstraction. The science ignores what anything is in itself. Its entities are merely considered in respect to their extrinsic reality, that is to say, in respect to their aspects in other things. But the abstraction reaches even further than that, for it is only the aspects in other things, as modifying the spatio-temporal specifications of the life histories of those other things, which count. The intrinsic reality of the observer comes in. I mean, what the observer is for himself is appealed to. For example, the fact that he will see red or blue enters into scientific statements. But the red which the observer sees does not in truth enter into science. What is relevant is merely the bare diversity of the observer's red experiences from all his other experiences. Accordingly, the intrinsic character of the observer is merely relevant in order to fix the self-identical individuality of the physical entities. These entities are only considered as agencies in fixing the roots in space and in time of the life histories of enduring entities. The phraseology of physics is derived from the materialistic ideas of the 17th century, but we find that, even in its extreme abstraction, what it is really presupposing is the organic theory of aspects as explained above. First consider any event in empty space where the word empty means devoid of electrons or protons or of any other form of electric charge. Such an event has three roles in physics. In the first place, it is the actual scene of an adventure of energy, either as its habitat or as the locus of a particular stream of energy. Anyhow, in this role the energy is there, either as located in space during the time considered, or as streaming through space. In its second role, the event is a necessary link in the pattern of transmission, by which the character of every event receives some modification from the character of every other event. In its third role, the event is the repository of a possibility as to what would happen to an electric charge, either by way of deformation or of locomotion, if it should have happened to be there. If we modify our assumption by considering an event which includes in itself a portion of the life history of an electric charge, then the analysis of its three roles still remains, except that the possibility embodied in the third role is now transformed into an actuality. In this replacement of possibility by actuality, we obtain the distinction between empty and occupied events. Recurring to the empty events, we note the deficiency in them of individuality of intrinsic content. Considering the first role of an empty event as being a habitat of energy, we note that there is no individual discrimination of an individual bit of energy, either as statically located or as an element in the stream. There is simply a quantitative determination of activity without the individualization of the activity in itself. This lack of individualization is still more evident in the second and third roles. An empty event is something in itself, but it fails to realize a stable individuality of content. So far as its content is concerned, the empty event is one realized element in a general scheme of organized activity. Some qualification is required when the empty event is the scene of the transmission of a definite train of recurrent waveforms. There is now a definite pattern which remains permanent in the event. We find here the first faint trace of enduring individuality, but it is individuality without the faintest capture of originality, for it is merely a permanence arising solely from the implication of the event in a larger scheme of patterning. Turning now to the examination of an occupied event, the electron has a determinate individuality. It can be traced throughout its life history through a variety of events. A collection of electrons, together with the analogous atomic charges of positive electricity, forms a body such as we ordinarily perceive. The simplest body of this kind is a molecule, and a set of molecules forms a lump of ordinary matter, such as a chair or a stone. Thus a charge of electricity is the mark of individuality of content, as additional to the individuality of an event in itself. This individuality of content is the strong point of the materialistic doctrine. It can, however, be equally well explained on the theory of organism. When we look into the function of the electric charge, we note that its role is to mark the origination of a pattern which is transmitted through space and time. It is the key of some particular pattern. For example, the field of force in any event is to be constructed by attention to the adventures of electrons and protons, and so also are the streams and distributions of energy. Further, the electric waves find their origin in the vibratory adventures of these charges. Thus the transmitted pattern is to be conceived as the flux of aspects throughout space and time derived from the life history of the atomic charge. The individualization of the charge arises by a conjunction of two characters, in the first place by the continued identity of its mode of functioning as a key for the determination of a diffusion of pattern, and in the second place by the unity and continuity of its life history. We may conclude, therefore, that the organic theory represents directly what physics actually does assume respecting its ultimate entities. We also notice the complete futility of these entities, if they are conceived as fully concrete individuals. So far as physics is concerned, they are wholly occupied in moving each other about, and they have no reality outside this function. In particular for physics, there is no intrinsic reality. It is obvious that the basing of philosophy upon the presupposition of organism must be traced back to Leibniz. His monads are for him the ultimately real entities, but he retained the Cartesian substances with their qualifying passions, as also equally expressing for him the final characterization of real things. Accordingly, for him there was no concrete reality of internal relations. He had therefore on his hands two distinct points of view. One was that the final real entity is an organizing activity, fusing ingredients into a unity, so that this unity is the reality. The other point of view is that the final real entities are substances supporting qualities. The first point of view depends upon the acceptance of internal relations binding together all reality. The latter is inconsistent with the reality of such relations. To combine these two points of view, his monads were therefore windowless, and their passions merely mirrored the universe by the divine arrangement of a pre-established harmony. This system thus presupposed an aggregate of independent entities. He did not discriminate the event, as the unit of experience, from the enduring organism as its stabilization into importance, and from the cognitive organism as expressing an increased completeness of individualization. Nor did he admit the many-termed relations relating sense data to various events in diverse ways. These many-termed relations are in fact the perspectives which Leibniz does admit, but only on the condition that they are purely qualities of the organizing monads. The difficulty really arises from the unquestioned acceptance of the notion of simple location as fundamental for space and time, and from the acceptance of the notion of independent individual substance as fundamental for a real entity. The only road open to Leibniz was thus the same as that later taken by Berkeley, in a prevalent interpretation of his meaning, namely an appeal to a deus ex machina who was capable of rising superior to the difficulties of metaphysics. In the same way as Descartes introduced the tradition of thought which kept subsequent philosophy in some measure of contact with the scientific movement, So Leibniz introduced the alternative tradition that the entities, which are the ultimate actual things, are in some sense procedures of organization. This tradition has been the foundation of the great achievements of German philosophy. Kant reflected the two traditions, one upon the other. Kant was a scientist, but the schools derivative from Kant have had but slight effect on the mentality of the scientific world. It should be the task of the philosophical schools of this century to bring together the two streams into an expression of the world picture derived from science, and thereby end the divorce of science from the affirmations of our aesthetic and ethical experiences. End of section 9.